Greetings. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to just go over a couple of things before we go to our guest today. And our principal aim in offering these events is to provide practical support and build the skills of the leaders of transition initiatives and all community leaders that participate on these calls. We really are, our focus is really to build that inner skill and resilience within the communities themselves. And we want to continue offering these at no cost, but do ask that you consider making a donation. We have a donation button at the top bar of our website at transitionus.org. And thank you in advance to those of you who are able to do this. And so now on to what we're doing today. It's building the capacity of our network. We've seen that there's so many great projects and so many activities, and we need to really sustain these. So we want to bring in more skill on one side, and also fund development is another aim of ours, and we're working this year to really help develop that. We hope to help initiatives to gain more skill in this area, as well as collaboratively working together with initiatives on some major funding that we hope to undertake as well. So without further ado, let me introduce Derek Rain. And Derek's been helping us for a number of years now. He's a fund development guru of ours and is really working on networks and helping networks build their capacity. And Derek is a chief catalyst at Rain Collaborative Consulting in Tacoma, Washington. And it's really focused on network capacity building and asset mobilization. And Derek will talk more about this. Derek's passion is for scaling social change strategies and implementing new approaches for problem solving using network weaving. He draws upon 12 years of program and management experience that he's had in assisting networks in building their strategies and scaling their impact. He's worked within a number of different organizations on community development, adult education, employment, youth employment, homelessness, HIV/AIDS, refugee and immigrant services, local economies, food systems, generational transition, and many more. And he's a board president for Go Local, an independent business network in Tacoma that's dedicated to fostering local economy. And without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Derek, in just a minute to introduce yourself, and then I want to go through our participants so that they can introduce themselves as well. So Derek, just a few words from you, and then you'll have the stage back shortly.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm really, really thrilled to be here today. Thanks to everybody who's on the call. I have to say about myself, I look at what I do kind of as wearing two different hats. One is that I'm a fund development professional and have been doing fundraising and fund development and resource development for a number of years, and so that spans a whole range of grant writing and individual donors and events and the whole cycle of fund development. And then the other hat that I wear, which I'm really, really excited about, is building the capacity of networks to become more effective, because networks are truly the way that society is now being organized. So I've done a lot of work locally, and I'm doing more work nationally on helping people understand how networks work and why they're such an important part of the solution to some of the social change challenges that we collectively face today. So those are the two hats that I wear, and we'll be talking about those more at length. But again, I'm really excited to be here, and thank you to everybody who is on the call today. I want to just kind of set the stage for the conversation today. Again, we're going to be talking about building the capacity of our overall network. And I really believe that Transition US has established an incredibly strong foundation to continue to build the movement, and that we're really positioned and primed for some amazing growth. And I just wanted to reflect on what some of that foundation is. There's 147 official initiatives in 37 states. There are a couple hundred molar groups that are in virtually every state in the country that are in the formative process. At any given time, there are dozens of projects that are going on in communities across this country as a result of Transition US's efforts. These projects are replicable programs and efforts that really are saturating the consciousness of communities to begin to have people start thinking about a different way of being in this world. They recently completed a very successful national tour with Rob Hopkins, and there are more and more partnerships that are starting to be facilitated as a result of all these efforts. And so I think that's a real huge success. And of course, the lifeblood of Transition US are the different volunteers and the different groups that are part of the official initiative. So I wanted to acknowledge that because it's an incredibly strong and powerful foundation to be building this national fundraising strategy, resource development strategy, and to help the movement build the capacity that it needs to fulfill its mission. And at the same time that we have this strong foundation, I think there are some significant challenges to think about. One is that the main hub, Caroline and Maggie and Marissa, there are, I think, 2.5 FTE full-time equivalents that are helping to support the 147 official initiatives that are also having to facilitate these partnerships and to provide the support nationally. And so there's a capacity issue at the national level. There also is a capacity issue, I would say, potentially in some of the initiatives. Initiatives could benefit tremendously from having additional volunteers, from having capital and monetary resources and in-kind resources to scale the efforts that they're already doing. Yet though we haven't really collectively come together to articulate how we might get there. And of course the other challenge is the moment in history that we are at. Every day you turn on the news and you can hear stories about, be it the drought in California, 500-year drought, or floods, or reports coming out on the nature of climate change. And I don't think ever before have we really been in a place historically where action is so much needed, which I think is part of the reason that so many people are interested and infused and inspired by the transition movement. I like to always quote Benjamin Franklin, who says, out of adversity comes opportunity. And I think that's really what I want to talk about today, is the opportunity that has presented itself to us to create a larger national strategy for building this movement from the bottom up, while at the same time increasing the impact and the scale of the efforts that we are all collectively undertaking. So what I want to do is really blend today with two major topics. One is how networks work and why really the Transition Network is so well positioned to take advantage of this massive paradigm shift that's happened in our society over the last 5 years, which is a shift away from an organizational-centric model to a network-centric mindset and model. And then the other topic, of course, is raising money, and raising money not in an entirely traditional way, but exploring ways that we might raise money and funding and resources through this network lens. So I mentioned that networks are the primary organizing model of the 21st century. And networks work in an entirely different way than organizations work. And networks have a lot of properties that are really fascinating when you look at the overall properties. So networks allow for information to be accessed very, very quickly. And they have the ability to leverage resources in remarkably efficient and innovative ways. Part of that is because networks link organizations and individuals that are both working on similar projects but are also having the same interests. And so there's a more capacity that can be had within a network mindset and within a network model, because the more linkages there are and the more relationships that are facilitated, the more opportunities there are. And along those same lines, networks are able to help facilitate connections and patterns and are emergent. There's a woman named June Hawley who some of you may know, and she's the mother of sorts of a field called network weaving. And she has a list of criteria that she uses, and she says, when you want to use a network approach. And if, as I go through some of these points, you might think, wow, this is so perfect for the transition movement. And in some ways, I think networks really mirror the guiding principles of transition. But June Hawley says, when there is a problem or opportunity that is big, is a good time to use a network approach. When you need new ideas or the solution is not clear, and of course, transforming our systems and our society into a resilient, sustainable, equitable, and just one, there's not necessarily a clear path to that. So we need new ideas. And we need to engage people from different backgrounds so that they actually have a whole bunch of voices coming to the table with different resources and ideas and connections. The other thing to note is that it's important to use a network approach when you want to build a new system. And many people are aware that the current system that we have, many of the structures within those systems were created many years ago for different purposes. And a lot of the byproducts of those systems are the things that we're also fighting against. So using a network approach has the benefit of being able to create new systems because it allows you to actually look from a larger level. The other thing that networks are able to do are a whole range of things that are incredibly powerful and are really timely given the fact that a lot of the problems that we're facing are very complex problems. So networks, as I may have mentioned, improve communication flow, and they open up new resources where resources may not have ever been imagined before. They also support and expand leadership because in networks, leadership is from the bottom up rather than the top down. And therefore they encourage collaboration, innovation, learning, they result in better outcomes, and they have the ability to facilitate scale and impact as information and innovations and breakthroughs are spread throughout the different parts of the network. So in networks, collaboration is everything. Everybody has a gift. Everybody has a place at the table. Everybody has access to resources or relationships that is vitally important. And so it becomes less about being a vertical structure and an organizational structure to looking at it from a horizontal perspective and saying all of the organizations and individuals that are connected and are part of this movement have something to offer each other. So really a network approach, it helps us think more strategically about who's at the table and how we can more creatively start to address problems. So, and within that, I won't go over, people can see the slides that I've sent out, but there's this whole idea of shifting to a network mindset away from an organizational-centric mindset that is really, really critical. And the more that we're able to shift into more of a horizontal and network way of thinking, where we're embracing collective intelligence and focusing on building relationships and weaving connections within the network, the more powerful the overall network becomes. So in networks, relationships are the currency, and that is such a key piece because it's also true that in fundraising and resource development, relationships are the currency. Well, the next chapter really looks at patterns of growth within networks and how networks grow. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's a really critical piece to understand for laying the groundwork for building the capacity of the overall transition network. And so for those that have slides, you can see that there's an overview slide of the different patterns. And for those that don't have it, I'll try to explain this as best I can. The first kind of phase and growth pattern of a network is what they refer to as scattered clusters. And so you might think about different transition initiatives or groups that you're connected to that are within your same local area, but they might not necessarily be connected across a wider geographic area. So there might not necessarily be Susan from Berkeley collaborating with Russell from California, collaborating with Dylan from Asheville at this point. In phase one, it's a very scattered fragment where a lot of the relationships are mostly localized relationships. And so the potential of this network at this point is very limited in terms of not only mobilizing resources, but facilitating collaborations that lead to larger scale impact. In the second phase, as the network moves to become more connected, which is really the overall goal of any network effort, is to increase the connectivity of the network, which really means how do you facilitate relationships between the different nodes in the network, which are either individuals or organizations. And in the second phase, it's called a hub and spoke network, where you might consider Transition US the hub, Maggie and Caroline and Marissa, as that main component that helps create the flow of information, that helps serve as that connecting piece for all the initiatives across the country. And through efforts like this, where we have an opportunity to get to know one another throughout the network. If that hub goes away, or if for some reason there's not a lot of participation and connectivity to that hub, the network is very, has a lot of risk in terms of its connectivity. But as I mentioned, as we move throughout this process, the idea is that we are creating more awareness of the power of networks and the power of facilitating connections between the different initiatives. So you might think about reaching out and identifying the same initiatives that are focusing on local food systems. Terry, for example, in Coeur d'Alene, there are certainly other initiatives that are focusing on that, or other groups that may be focusing on time banks or reskilling efforts. So as those groups become more solidified and more working groups become more connected, you have the emergence of multiple hubs and organizations and individuals that have multiple relationships throughout the entire network. The ultimate goal is to get to a really dense core network which has several individuals or organizations or initiatives that serve as the hub, that are connected to virtually every single node in the network. And the advantage of this is that, let's say there's an initiative that's very loosely connected, but has an amazing idea or an amazing breakthrough or an innovation. What ends up happening is, because you have a densely connected core and a loosely connected periphery, that innovation and idea can quickly be spread throughout the entire network and replicated. And so this is a really important concept to have, especially as we transition to the idea of building the capacity through resource development, because there might be somebody on the outside of an initiative that isn't necessarily engaged, that has the social capital or relational capital to help leverage resources that could benefit the entire network. So again, the phases of growth are really all about how do we create more synergy within the network, and we do that by expanding the relationships that we have, reaching out to other initiatives that are working on similar projects. Passion really builds passion, and really weaving the entire network together. And the more that we're able to do that, the more overall success the individual initiatives are going to have, but also collectively as a movement, the overall Transition US movement is going to have. So maybe at this point what we can do is have people, if they're interested, list some of the efforts locally or nationally that you're connected to. And if people want to maybe chime in by raising their hand, and maybe your initiative is collaborating with another transition group in a neighboring city, or maybe you've established a partnership with an independent business alliance or a gardening organization or what have you. If people want to just chime in and share what organizations that they're connected to through their current efforts, that is something that I can invite to occur right now.
So press 1 on your keypad, or I guess, Larry, you've pressed 3, but others can press 1 and we'll call on you. Go ahead, Larry. Oh, maybe Larry, were you maybe...
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was on mute, sorry.
Okay.
In our case, we're a very rural area of Northern California, and so we've started collaborations with a number of other groups that are like-minded. We have a permaculture guild in our area, and we're sharing with them. We have a grange in our area. We're working with them. We now are starting to have inroads in the schools, so we're working with some school clubs and so forth. And then the last couple of weeks ago, we just had our first bioregional meeting. Susan Silver was involved with that from Berkeley, and we had a first North Coast bioregion where 5 counties of Northern California got together, and we're all starting to share information and network. So that's a collaborative effort that's been developing over the last year.
Thank you. Wonderful. Susan?
Yeah, the Berkeley Transition Network initiative has. We always partner with different groups. Berkeley in Northern California has such an amazing array of groups working on community resilience, and I just want to add that a lot of these groups, they don't call themselves transition initiatives, but they're doing just that. They have very similar goals, and so I just want to really encourage people to think about groups that don't call themselves initiatives, but really, can we ask yourself, can you partner with them as well? We have a ton of groups working on urban agriculture and the permaculture guilds and time banks, and we have a monthly movie night, and each month we partner with a number of different local groups. Also, East Bay Co-Housing we partner with, so the sky's the limit. We have a tremendous amount of groups that we partner with.
Yeah, Northern California definitely is lush with lots of great things. I'm sure a lot of other areas are too. Thank you, Susan. Jessica?
Yeah, hi. Actually, this has been a project of ours over the past few months, where we're calling it a Resiliency Alliance in Milwaukee, because just like Northern California, there's so much happening. We have a ton of smaller organizations or services that are getting out there in the community, and so over the past few months, we've been able to list and find contacts for over 200 different organizations. And what we're talking about now is how to encourage or how to build a tool that these organizations would actually want to communicate on, so that we can all kind of find each other. So that's where that's going right now, and that's Milwaukee's update.
Great, thank you. And Barbara Weinstein.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
A couple things to mention. We're planning a major event in March, which was going to be a kind of a leadership event to draw people together from all kinds of organizations in our area. And so far we have over 200 people on the list of people we're going to invite. And it's going to be a day-long event that we're going to call Reimagining the Future. And we're going to do some visioning and backcasting and networking and getting people together. So we're pretty excited about that. We also have an effort, and I was interested in what was just said about kind of mapping out where resources are, because we also have a project in parallel going on to do some resource mapping here in the area with organizations and people and services.
And that's in Palo Alto, Silicon
That's
Valley?
in Palo Alto. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. And we have one more. Oh, no, that's it, Derek.
Okay. Well, I always like to ask that, not only so people can hear what other groups are being involved. But really, I agree very much with Susan, is that a lot of people that are focused on these efforts, and a lot of organizations, it's almost like there's this movement of movements that's happening, and people are really aware of the necessity of making these larger changes. And so they might not call themselves transition, but really it's the larger emerging paradigm that we are all a part of, which is recreating, and exactly what Barbara said, reimagining the future together. And so the reason I mention that is because oftentimes when we think about networks, we think only exclusively of the groups that are like us. And so it sounds like you all are already reaching out to groups that have different assets and have different resources and have different opportunities that they can bring to the table. And that's really, really critical in building a successful local, regional, or national network and movement, because it allows, again, for the opening of new resources and the opening of new ideas, and for the exploring of new opportunities that in a more restrictive or less diverse setting you would not get. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's really, really important. So we might be asking, okay, what does the network piece have to do with building our capacity? Well, one of the things that I am really interested in and have been working on for a little while is how funders and donors there's this paradigm shift also that's happening within philanthropy. And funders and donors are beginning to understand that the problems that are facing our communities and our planet are becoming more and more complex. And so investing in singular organizations and investing in one or two projects doesn't cut it anymore, because the scale of the problems are so large that you have to make more strategic investments. And really that is looking at solutions that require collaboration and more coordination among and between different groups that are focused on the same outcome and the same mission. And as this kind of shift has been happening over the last few years, people are understanding that if there are innovations and breakthroughs, they need to be scaled, because in some ways, and I really think this is true within the climate change world, we don't have the luxury of time to independently be recreating the wheel in all of our communities. And so within the network lens, sharing information and being open to learning and collaboration is a really huge asset right now, because that is one of the key strategies for addressing these complex issues. Funders and donors also recognize that networks are more agile and adaptive than individual organizations, and they have the capacity to be more responsive to the needs on the ground because of the way that collaborations and information can flow. So there's more opportunities within the network way of working. And so a few years ago, there was a report some of you that are in fundraising may have seen, by a group called the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And for me, this came as almost a watershed moment in terms of funders thinking about funding networks rather as a way of accelerating social change. And this report, Catalyzing Networks for Social Change by the Monitor Institute, is a funder's guide. And if you look at the funders that were involved in this funding, they're some of the largest foundations in our country. And they walked funders through the process of funding networks and came up with a list of suggestions. And one of their suggestions at the time was to look at doing experiments, because the field of funding networks is really still in its infancy, and funders as well as networks themselves are really beginning to understand the power, the transformational power that networks have. And as time has gone on, there's been more literature around funding networks. Some of you may have seen, too, and be familiar with the REAMP Energy Network, which I think is one of the reasons why there's been so much emphasis and interest in funding networks, because of the scale and the impact that this effort has had. And for those who aren't familiar with this, I have a slide on a great case study that came out in the fall of 2010, and basically what this Reamp Energy Network was 125 nonprofits and funders from across 8 states in the Midwest, with the bold goal of reducing global warming emissions 80% by 2050. And what they were able to do is create a network structure that really embraced the wide range of constituency groups that were interested in addressing that issue and being part of that solution. And they created working groups around this effort. And the impact was absolutely incredible. They were able to pass energy efficiency policies in 6 states. As a network, they were able to halt the development of 28 coal power plants being produced, because just as one state was able to reject and mobilize against that, the company might be looking at an adjacent state, and because the network had the ability to be adaptive and change, they were able to mobilize advocacy efforts on the ground there. The other thing that happened throughout this process was the overall capacity of the individual organizations were increased, and in part because organizations realized that they didn't have to do everything themselves, that they were able to rely and be within this collaborative space, so that they were able to bring the assets and the gifts that they had to the table, and then rely upon the others, organizations and individuals that were involved to help facilitate the solutions. Funding of the groups also went up, and there was a working group of foundations that made substantial impacts and investments into this. And the other thing that happened is they were able to collectively create resources that were able to be used by all of the different groups involved, so that they could individually, on a localized level, create the impacts that they wanted to. So the way I look at it is that there's this big shift that is still in its infancy around funding networks and understanding the power and potential of coming together in this larger collaborative space to tackle these complex problems that are really the challenge of our generation. And so to transition into how this works in more of a network-based fund strategy that we would be looking at exploring as a national network, I want to give a little bit of a super reductionistic view of traditional resource development, and then talk a little bit about how I think that could be translated into Transition US as a national network. But before I do, I want to pause to see if anybody has thoughts or comments based on the stuff that I've just been talking about.
So again, just press 1 on your keypad. And Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about funding for networks. Are there any specific foundations that you would point to that are really focused on funding such networks as you described?
Yeah, I think if you look at, I think the Packard Foundation is really interested in funding networks. But if you look at the report by the Monitor Institute, part of the reason I took that report so seriously is because if you look at the funders that are connected to that report, you have the largest foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Cerna Foundation, Packard Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, just a whole range of funders, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, that once you start hearing them, you're just like, oh, those are among the largest foundations in the country. There's also an interesting one actually in the Southeast, which I think more focuses on poverty, but it's the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation. And they have actually reassigned their program officers to be what they refer to as network officers, because they see the power in linking their grantees together to mobilize for a common cause and a common issue. And so there are a lot of foundations that I think are still learning about networks and still beginning to become interested. The other piece that I think is really interesting related to that actually is that recently the Council on Foundations, which is the National Trade Association for all foundations, including community and family and private foundations, announced that they were implementing a network approach nationally to link the foundations that are their members together. And so what they're doing, and this happened I think last fall, is and I think it's in part because of some visionary leadership, they are beginning a mapping process of the foundations in California and in New England to see where there might be opportunities to convene foundations that are working to fund similar areas of interest. And again, I think that is in part due to the fact that the problems and the scale of the problems that we're facing are so complex that individual institutional investments are no longer enough, and that we need to think more creatively and look at making larger institutional and really network investments to create the kind of change. So those are a few that I am aware of, but I think more and more funders are going to be more interested in having a dialogue about that, and that's where I think some of those resources I mentioned could be really helpful to articulate a case to a funder to be able to understand the benefits of funding a network approach rather than a simple organizational approach. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to lay out a little bit of what I, again, refer to as a very reductionistic view of what I refer to as traditional fund and resource development. And that's really rooted in the organizational-centric model. And I look at that really from a life cycle perspective from organizations. And basically it goes like this. Organizations start small, and they get volunteers and some money and some in-kind contributions to launch a few projects, and then they begin to grow. And as they grow, they increase their capacity because they have increased interest and increased impact. But that capacity requires more resources. And so oftentimes organizations, especially within the nonprofit sector, go through this organizational development cycle that you have a lot of passion at the very beginning, and then you go through the formal processes of becoming a 501c3 structured organization and creating policies and getting a board and doing a lot of things that are much more organizational centric, just as a reality of being part of that growth. And once you land some staffing and have the capacity to implement more pieces, and you have to introduce a traditional fundraising approach and a marketing approach and a program approach, which comes with a whole bunch of strings around evaluation and reporting and all that stuff. But the essence is that the more resources are invested in the organization, the more they require increased fundraising efforts to sustain, which is not to say that that's a wrong approach, but that is part of the life cycle. And so the idea is that you're continually growing your organization to address a problem. And so sometimes that includes a plateauing effect over time, and eventually you have to go through a renewal or a decline. And the reason I'm mentioning this is in part because I think one of the interesting opportunities to think creatively about how we approach capacity building for this network is that, again, we don't really have the luxury of time, in my opinion, for every initiative and every effort to go through a formal organizational-centric development model to get to the point where they have the capacity they need to address the problems in their communities. I don't think we have the time to do that. So instead, what I'd like to propose, and this is what we've been talking about with Transition US and the Hub, is looking at developing a network fund development approach. And that approach is really drastically different and is still, it's kind of an idea. And so you might think of this as a piloting and a pitching of an idea to get some feedback on. And the idea is basically that everybody in this network, all 15 or 20 of us on the call today, have an incredible amount of social capital and loose ties and connections to people that not only may have resources and capacity, but also to people that truly understand this critical juncture that we are at in our history as a species and on this planet, and who want to be part of a larger movement for change. And because we have those connections, pooling those connections actually makes us stronger as a network instead of doing a more traditional approach where we have an individual initiative looking to grow or an individual organization looking to grow into a formal organization. Collectively, by pooling our social capital, we have the ability to grow this network in an exponential fashion. And that relies on what is referred to in the network world on complex reciprocity and trust. So you might think to yourself, yeah, I know somebody that has capacity or is really interested in working and supporting reskilling efforts in communities. But the group that I'm involved in right now is not working on a reskilling effort. So I might not tap that social capital in order to try to mobilize resources. But as we become more connected and as we become more aware, we might think, wow, there's actually 25 different transition initiatives around the country that are focused on reskilling in some capacity. And what would it look like if we were to have faith and trust of engaging the people that we're all connected to through our social capital to convene them around a conversation about what would it look like to support those 25 reskilling efforts. The idea is that as we increase our connections and our awareness of what the efforts that are currently are, we are actually able to build more collaboration and build synergy into this whole movement. And part of that is that we're addressing the need that donors and funders have to see larger change and impact, which is really, I think, one of the things that people are really, truly interested in is people want to make transformational investments of time, of their talents and their treasures into efforts that are really going to be producing results. And so ultimately what we're looking to do is to figure out a way collectively to leverage our collective social capital that's embedded within our network to support initiatives throughout the entire country, while at the same time supporting the main hub so that they have the capacity that they need to ensure that more and more initiatives have the resources to succeed. So there might be local economies projects throughout the country. As I mentioned, there might be reskilling projects throughout the country. Maggie just had mentioned to me that there's a whole group that's emerging around transition streets that is forming a working group. There might be groups based on solar energy projects or green building projects. And we know that these groups and these efforts are all underway, but they're so loosely connected right now that each of them individually is trying to garner the resources that they need to be successful and to see the scale and the impact. Whereas if we think more strategically about who we're all connected to and who we might actually be able to have and engage in conversations around supporting these collective efforts, what we'll be able to do is to identify people that we can include in a larger conversation around each of these different efforts to support that with their time, talent, and treasure to increase the impact that we're able to collectively have. There's a picture I have for those that have the slides of what I thought was the best visual representation that I could find on the internet, which is the picture of the map of the U.S. with all these lines coming out of it. And these are for me, it represents not only the different efforts that are sharing their common areas, but also the relationships that we're all connected to. I mean, I know so many different people from just doing the work that I've done that are so interested in local food systems and transforming local food systems, not only locally but nationally, that I would love to invite to a conversation with 20 or 30 other transition groups that are in various phases of implementing that. But right now we're still in that phase of development where we're beginning to know each other and getting to know the movement, that it's not yet the right time. But that's really the next step, I think, is how do we create that connectivity and that awareness so that we are actually totally able to leverage the social capital that we have. And that is not only to build the resources and the funding that we need, but I'm aware that there are people out there that have the skill sets that could help accelerate change on the ground but because they're not necessarily connected to these overall efforts, they're not able right now to have the impact that they want to have. So in my thinking around this, and hopefully that makes some sense to people, maybe that's what we can do is have a conversation. I'll stop for talking about next steps, but what I've tried to do is articulate a little bit about how we might start working together to leverage our social capital by streamlining the efforts that are currently shared efforts so that we can have a larger coordinated effort to build our movement. So, I don't know, maybe I can have some feedback on this idea and see if it makes any sense to people, see what people's initial thoughts are.
Thank you, Derek. And I know that some people often can only stay for an hour, so I think we'll see some people drop off, but we'll be in touch with you by email as well for more ideas. So Susan, go ahead.
So I had a question about this idea. Were you talking about a national effort or a regional effort? Because I've noticed in doing tons of fundraising that a lot of foundations, they fundraise only on a regional basis. So that would be my question. And also, were you thinking outside the box of foundation and more the crowdfunding model?
Yeah, kind of both, actually. I think that's a good question. So initially what I would be looking at, I think we would be looking at trying to procure national resources that we could then leverage on a local level. So the idea would be, what if we could engage some of these larger funders that are beginning to support networks and to secure what would be maybe the equivalent of a lead gift for a larger multi-year capacity building campaign, that then we could go down to the regional and local level and say, we have, $500,000 that we're trying to leverage to increase the resiliency efforts in the 5-county region of Northern California. And these are the types of projects that we're doing. And these projects are linked nationally to other efforts that are sharing best practices. So that's kind of the initial idea, is that we would go from a national level, if possible, to a regional and then to a local level. But I think it's very fluid, and that's also where, obviously, depending on where the relationships are, it could take on a life of its own. And I think definitely the crowdfunding piece is a huge piece of that idea as well, because I think, again, people really want to make a big impact with their dollars. And if they saw that there were all these efforts that were being coordinated and working together to impact change in many regions, I think that would be an incredibly compelling reason for somebody to give $5 or $10 or more.
And Larry, go ahead.
I want to follow up on Susan's question here, but really talk more from a logistics aspect, and that is, you throw an idea out, we give some feedback, but who writes the grants? I mean, does it come from Transition US? Do we collaborate on the grant in a Google Doc? I'm just concerned about getting something on paper that we can all look at and agree upon and move forward. I mean, for example, this transition streets, I think we are all interested in doing something. We need a model proposal put together. Who's going to write it?
Well, I want to jump in just because we do have a model proposal for transition streets already, Larry, and Transition US would likely take the lead on the funding. On the grant proposals, we have a lot of collateral already written from lots of other grants, etc., and certainly would welcome input or have sections written by others, that sort of thing. But Derek, did you have anything to chime in on that as well?
Well, that would be part of, I think, part of the next step. I know I have been working with this other grant writer on trying to put together just this to host this initial conversation, but I know what I do for a living is write grants, and secured $20 million in the last 3 or 4 years, and this other person has an equally reputable track record. And so what we're looking at is how can we support the overall movement, and at the same time find ways to distribute the money through Transition US. And so I think we have some volunteers that are willing to do some of the grant writing. But there might be other people, and I think that's the other part of this conversation is who, maybe there's somebody out there who has experience doing grants that would be interested in being on an ad hoc fund development team. I know that there's some people that have expressed interest in doing that, but from my perspective, it's really how do we get a core group of people together that are really interested in exploring this idea of local, regional, and national collaborative funding to build the movement. Because for me, it comes down to the fact that there's so much passion out there that if there was $5,000 or $10,000 of money for people to really use to help catalyze that passion, I think the impacts would be unbelievable.
Thank you. Kim, go ahead.
Yes, hi, this is Kim from Transition Newton. I wanted to mention that we have a Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub that has been meeting, we started in 2010, but we've really expanded to lots of different states and lots of different transition groups starting last May. And we've been doing aside from just sharing our different projects that we're working on and supporting each other, we're working on trying to do things together. One of them, for example, is emergency preparedness. And what would we do if, things really broke down on the East Coast or in the Mid-Atlantic region? How do we communicate amongst each other? And so we're kind of, helping each other through this. So, it's interesting. It would be interesting to see if we could get some type of funding, because some of the roadblocks that we're running into is just the time that people have in our transition groups, where we're focused on working within our groups and then also on a regional level. But if we did have some funding, that might change the game a little bit. So, I wanted to let you know there is a lot of work being done out there, I know, by the Mid-Atlantic Transition Group right now.
Thanks for bringing that to our attention more, Kim. I'm aware of that, but great to hear even more depth is going on, and that's good. So, Derek, your thoughts?
Well, I think that's really great, Kim, and I think, what I really wanted to do is kind of throw this out and see what people thought, but that actually might be a really solid place to start, is to say, here's a regional group that is a hub that's been working together for 3 or 4 years that has a program area of emergency preparedness. And I think that there could not only be some potential prospecting, but really some support around developing a framework for funding. Because I think that's, for me, when I really think about it, and having looked at other and been a part of other larger movements, I've been for probably about 5 years involved in the local economies movement in Bali and Amoeba, and what I see oftentimes happen is that you have incredible volunteer groups that are able to do an incredible amount of things, but what ends up happening is they end up running up against the wall that the realities of time and resources are just so finite that they don't have the ability to take it to the next level. And if there were resources available, transformational change could happen in a very quick way. And so I think maybe part of maybe one of the next steps is to look at and help identify other efforts that are similar to that, where there are multiple groups that are collaborating across the region that are almost maybe primed for funding to be invested, to see how they might be able to maybe pilot this approach on a regional level. So that's one thought that I would have.
Derek, thanks. I know we're getting close to our time.
Yeah.
And Terry, you have your hand up, and we're going to wrap up shortly. Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, hi. So I said I'm not working with a transition group because there isn't one around here, but and even the concept of a food system is alien to a lot of people where I live. So one of the ideas I've had I work as a development officer in one of my incarnations, and I've been studying models for, in addition to grant writing, which is a very specialized skill set and hard to find people who are good at doing that. I've been thinking about the idea of really how do we work with major donors, and part of it for me is learning a language, coming up with a language to explain these very complex interrelationships to people in a way that is accessible. And because there are people here, at least where I live, who are, can write out a check for $50,000 and not even notice it in their bank account. And I think it's probably true where most of us live, but it's, part of it is just knowing, just like in a grant, you have to be able to market what you're trying to accomplish. The same can be said for working with donors. So for myself, and I really appreciate, I think it was, this woman's name was Susan, who said, people like, actually she didn't use my name, but people like me, I'm doing transition work. Food systems work is inherently a transition kind of activity, which is why I'm following the transition movement. So I feel a great allegiance with the work of the transition movement, but that's not how I identify myself, even though a lot of the ideas that you're grappling with are applicable to what I'm doing just as much.
Thank you, Terry. Derek, did you have comments about that?
Yeah, I think the major donor piece is really the other piece of the equation, and I think from my perspective, I think that's that's often sometimes easier to get money from people if you're able to articulate a case and to build the relationships with them. And again, I think you're right. I think there are people. For me, when I step back and I think all the people that are even just on this call, who we're connected to and who we might be able to engage in a conversation about looking at things in a different way to increase our impact collectively, I get really excited about that idea. And it's because I know that in a lot of people's hearts right now, there's this uncertainty about how the next 5 years is going to go, how the next 10 years is going to go. There's a guy out here named Jason McLennan who's in charge of the green building group, and he said to me 3 years ago, he's like, we're in the first year of the last decade that we have to make the most transformational change in human history. And I really believe that that's true, and we have to think in much more collaborative and much more out-of-the-box ways, and yet we also have to acknowledge that resources are really essential to achieving that change. And it's kind of ironic. I saw him a couple of months ago in passing in Portland, and I said, that comment really made a lot of an impact on me. And he looked at me right in the eye, and he said, now we have 7 years. And so I think there's a lot of people that are aware on an intuitive level, on maybe a spiritual level or what have you, that, or even just a practical level, that massive change needs to happen. And I think, entering in and continuing a dialogue around what are some creative ways that we can think about securing the resources that we collectively need to continue to build this movement and to ensure that change actually happens. I think that's a conversation that I would welcome for maybe a next step if people want to continue to have that conversation, because I think for me it's really the biggest question of our time and how we get there. There's a million ways of how we get there, and there's not one right way, but having a dialogue I think is a really good place to start.
Derek, thank you. We're almost out of time. I think folks are going to go over a few minutes for those of you who can, and those of you who can't, we will be emailing people and asking for your input. I'll do a poll shortly that will see who would like to have sort of another call in this vein to maybe go to next steps a little more quickly. And so we'll take Susan's call next, or question next. And if you could also, folks on the call, just let us know before anybody else has to go. Press 1 on your keypad if you would like to have another call. We've set the stage. We've got to this point. We won't have much time to do next steps on this call. If you'd like to have the next round where we go into next steps, more logistical, as Larry was suggesting, do press 1 on your keypad. If you prefer not to, just want to sort of see the cliff notes, you can press 2. And don't press anything if that neither pertains to you. So Susan, your question?
Comment and a question. one of the approaches I see for broadening our movement and getting more support, more funding, is using different messaging for people that don't really understand what transition is all about. And so using things like, community service, community building, food security, looking at is resilience the new sustainability, things that so many more people can resonate with. Like here in California, we're talking about water a lot more. So what are your thoughts around that? Just using much more broad-based messaging so that people really understand what we are talking about.
Yeah, I think it's key, and I think part of it is it depends on who you're talking to. I'm a big fan of meeting people where they are, so I agree that communication has to be accessible, and the language that we use has to be able to resonate with whoever we're talking to. So I think that's part of this conversation. Really, it's how do we articulate the case that may actually be different depending on the audience, but we have to really think strategically about that. And I think that's an incredibly important point because if the language could be more accessible and that could help us secure more resources, we should definitely explore that.
Great. So we are at time and got a lot of feedback. Most people on the call would like to have another call, so I'll work on setting that up with you, Derek. And again, we'll send out an email to folks, and you can enter into a discussion. And any other sort of next immediate steps, Derek?
No, I think the only other thing that I would say is I really appreciate people's thoughts, and if there are things that people think about, on the slides I've included my email address, and so feel free to email me any thoughts that you have. And I don't know if there's a listserv or anything for people on this call, but I think it would be great if people have thoughts to either email me or to email other people, and when we reconvene, we can begin to explore those thoughts. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share these ideas and to start this dialogue.
And thank you, Derek, for bringing this to us. And we're really in a new place with building this collaborative muscle. And look forward to doing this. Look forward to bringing in resources for all of the transition efforts. And Maggie is able to set up a listserv, so we'll do that. I'll send out the recording as well. And again, you'll be able to email Derek, maybe CC myself, Caroline, so that we're in a good loop, and we'll set up another call. So tremendous. Thank you, Derek. I'm really looking forward to all of this work that we can catalyze as a network.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for everybody for being on the call, and have a fantastic day.